Check your sense of urgency
I have-
of the project.
I have one question. So
Yeah.
Go, start with yours.
Okay, are we ready?
Yeah, we're rolling.
I'd like you to talk about when you did first become introduced to Albert Block and discovered that he was there. You went over to talk about how you went over to Anna's, to Alabama Street, and when it was,
Yeah.
was the third story attic studio, and what you saw there, and what you found, and how you reacted to it.
Well, of course, I first became exposed to Albert Block when I saw the paintings that Scott Heffley was working on up in the conservation studio of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. And in the process of conserving these paintings, Scott became very close to Anna, and it was he who arranged for me to go up and visit with her and meet her and see the paintings in the studio. And of course, it's somewhat startling to go there because it's a very modest wood frame house that's just one block from the football stadium at the University of Kansas. It's in a kind of student neighborhood, so you often have sort of rock and roll blaring and that kind of thing. And then to think of this as the kind of spiritual retreat of this modernist who showed in the Blue Rider exhibition was really kind of an uncanny experience for me. And of course, the studio is quite fascinating. It's exactly the way it was when Albert Block died. His easel is still there, his paints are still there, his palette is still there, just as it was at the moment that he died. When I first went up there, the paintings were just kind of leaning up against the wall. They've since been arranged in racks, but it was actually quite cumbersome to look at things because to look at any one painting, you needed to move about 20 other paintings to get to it. So it was, frankly, it was hard to completely sort out what Block was up to as an artist, but it was really quite fascinating and obviously a kind of overwhelming trove of material.
When over the years, Anna Block has been a source of inspiration, a guide to people into the world of Albert Block. Many of us have spent time in the studio sitting with her, with individual paintings put up on Albert Block's easel, and then just looking at them and letting the silence, letting the pictures speak in silence. Did you do any of that? And if so, tell us what reaction you had to looking at paintings in that way.
Well, of course, Anna Block is a truly lovely person, and I think she's sort of the perfect artist's widow. She's at once totally devoted to Albert Block, but she also, she's not sort of unpleasantly controlling the way so many of these artists' widows are, and she actually gave us quite a lot of freedom in organizing the show and really let us do it according to the way we felt it should be done and didn't sort of attempt to micromanage what we were doing. Of course, it's quite moving to look at paintings with her in the studio, and I think that, well, of course, she has this kind of rapturous devotion to these paintings that's really, it's very moving.
Well, I have a question. What do you think happened to Albert Block's art when he came to Kansas? This is backtracking a little bit.
Yeah. Block's painting went through quite a shift when he came to Kansas, and one of the basic changes is that the palette goes through a kind of metamorphosis. That before that time, his paintings are quite colorful, admittedly sometimes in a somewhat harsh way, which is typical of German painting. It's not that kind of sweet color sense that you get in French paintings. But after Block came to Kansas, there's a different color dialogue that starts to take place in his work, and increasingly you see paintings that are based on the contrast between earth tones and white, and I think that this became a kind of metaphor for Block. On the other hand, he's thinking of earthly substance and even the kind of biblical idea that human beings are made of earth. And then the colors white and to some extent blue seem to become emblematic of the spirit in some way. And it's the fusion of this whiteness with these earth colors that creates a kind of, I would say prismatic effect, but it's not a fully colored effect, but there's a kind of vibration between these two elements which animates his paintings.
There's a couple of different views, probably 20 different views about Albert Bloch's later works after he comes back from Europe. But one is he became retrograde, he went backwards, he took a trip back into time, and then what became more representational, abandoned the movement of modern art. Others have said he moved away from anything unique and into sort of solipsism of not being able to communicate any kind of iconography that people would recognize anymore. Others say his work became more individual, more greater contribution to American art. So this is sort of who do people say that I am. Would you comment on what you feel about those various opinions? Because there are some very strong opinions that have been expressed by art historians, people in the commercial art world, art critics, and so forth.
Albert Bloch's late work has inspired quite a divergence of opinion, and for people like Anna Bloch and many of the students who were close to Bloch, the people who knew him, many of these people feel that these are the greatest examples of Bloch's work. On the other hand, the kind of commercial art world has much less interest in Bloch's Kansas paintings than in the earlier paintings from the German period. And in fact, when we organized an exhibition of his work, there was pressure from some quarters to leave out the later work. I think in the end, all the people who organized the show became quite strong in the belief that they should be included. And Bloch's later work is he's kind of clearly stepped off the highway of modern art. He's off in his own place somewhere. But I find the best of Bloch's paintings, late paintings, profoundly moving and quite up to the standard of any of his earlier works. And I think, for example, the painting The Blue Bough is really a kind of wonderful summation of what the Blue Rider movement was all about. I think that there's a kind of Proustian quality to Bloch's later work. This is someone who is living in a world of memory and spirit, and in that way it's very different from some of the early paintings, which are, particularly some of the very early ones, are really the paintings of a very brash young man. But I suppose what I would say is that the different phases of Bloch's work seem to me very in tune with what happens when you go from being young to being old. And in that way, both sides of his career are quite eloquent, but in different ways. Yeah.